My wife asked for a divorce to run away with my best friend. Now he abandoned her. She came back with nothing and begging for forgiveness. But I coldly said, "This house is no longer your home." In all honesty, I never imagined that my life could be divided so sharply between a before and an after, as if someone had run a very sharp knife through the center of my timeline. I begin by remembering the afternoon I saw her for the first time, because from that moment a series of events were unleashed that I am still unraveling. I was in my final semesters of business administration. I liked the idea of learning formulas for the family business to prosper, although what I was truly passionate about was getting my hands dirty in my father's workshop. She, I will call her Elle to preserve some intimacy, studied literature, and always carried a notebook under her arm. Those hardcover ones, covered with clippings from literary magazines. We met at an end-of-exams party at a classmate's house. It was one of those narrow places where the music bounces off the walls and no one can hope to have a conversation without shouting. I felt out of place, leaning against the refrigerator, drinking a beer that was starting to get warm. Then, she appeared, dazed by the volume, and asked me with a conspiratorial gesture if that noise was not unbearable. I nodded, imitating her complicit expression, and told her we should look for a less strident place. We ended up on the balcony, and there I listened to her talk about her love for the impossible poems of Emily Dickinson and the atypical novels of Italo Calvino. I laughed because my reading list was reduced to carburetor manuals, but she was fascinated with my stories about disassembled engines. We walked at dawn back to the student residence, and those hours were imprinted on me like the certainty of having met a piece that fit with mine. For the next 2 years, we were the couple that always appears hugging in the hallways and reserves the same table in the university cafeteria. We spent entire afternoons exploring secondhand bookstores, improvising bicycle races down the old avenue, and weekends in my parents' garage, where my father patiently instructed her on the beauty of a gleaming engine block after a thorough cleaning. My circle of friends, R&J, accepted her as one of their own from the first moment. They had known me since childhood. Together we formed our tiny gang, the Bcry, when we believed that our BMX bikes would take us around the world. R, restless and always ready for practical jokes. J, with his stories of fire and rescues because he already dreamed of being a firefighter. T, the meticulous guy who did the accounting, even for the tips, when we pooled money for pizzas. The last piece of the group was C. Nickname: Captain, because without asking permission he directed the camps, assigned roles in street games, and solved maps as if he had been born with an internal compass. C and I shared secrets that we did not tell anyone. We swore to be best men at each other's weddings and to support each other in crucial moments. For me, his word was unbreakable. When he and I graduated, adult life arrived wrapped in new obligations, but also in the intoxication of freedom. She got a job at the municipal library in the youth section. Within a few months, she was already organizing book clubs for children and open mic nights for budding poets. I went to work with my father full-time, planning to turn that workshop into a company capable of servicing heavy machinery and attracting clients from all over the region. Money was not plentiful, so we rented a tiny studio in a quiet neighborhood. We cooked together, with just enough space for 2 pans and a wooden plate that we used as a cutting board. Some nights, after an exhausting day, we did not even have dinner. We would turn on the portable radio, lie down on a hand-me-down mattress, and listen to the rain hit the blinds. There, in the midst of modesty, we were unbreakable. We got married 4 years later. The wedding was so simple that my aunts still laugh, remembering how the hired band was replaced at the last minute by my cousin with an acoustic guitar and a speaker. My parents lent the garage as a party hall. The tables were covered with checkered tablecloths, and a family friend cooked a giant stew for all the guests. She was radiant in a dress bought at a second-hand store and altered by her roommate. I could hardly believe that happiness could feel so tangible. C, of course, was my best man and made sure that every improvised detail went well. In his speech, he spoke of brotherhood forged on wheels and chain grease, and how I was proof that quiet guys can also win the best of smiles. After the honeymoon, a weekend on the coast staying in a modest guest house, routines set in, but not in a bitter way. Elle and I had decided that a stable life was not synonymous with boredom. She continued with her cultural projects. Sometimes she would come home with boxes of donated books that she would pile by the door until she found a place for them in the library. I, for my part, became more and more involved in the workshop and started hiring a couple of assistants because the clientele was growing. We adjusted our schedules to have at least one night a week dedicated to us. Homemade pizza on Tuesdays and some old movie she found in the library's catalog. On weekends, whenever we could, we organized dinners with the Becry. C's garage, larger than our living room, would become an improvised dance floor with Christmas lights hanging and rock music playing from a portable speaker that Jay insisted on modifying to increase the bass. It was the time when I believed that loyalty was an inexorable law. My friends were my brothers and my wife, my life partner. Innocent me, I could not imagine cracks in such a wall. Around our 10th anniversary, small changes began that I did not know how to read at the time. Elle would talk to me about the need to try something new, to travel to a country where it was always summer, to learn an exotic language, to publish a children's book. I would nod with the best intention, but my usual response was that we should save first, organize the workshop better, wait for things to stabilize. Her smile would fade, and she would retreat into her plans in solitude. She stopped asking me to accompany her to book presentations because I would arrive tired and prefer to sleep. She started going out more with colleagues from the library and, as she told me, with a group of artists that C had introduced her to at a local poetry festival. I suspected nothing. C was my brother for life. Why should I be wary? At that time, I was busy with an important contract. A company in the region needed us to adapt machinery for a construction project, and I was spending extra hours at the workshop. I would come back late, eat the first thing I found in the refrigerator, and sometimes fall asleep on the couch without greeting her. She began texting until the early morning. If I approached, she would pick up the phone and say it was work business. One night, I heard her laugh from the other side of the bathroom door. I asked who she was talking to, and she replied that it was her book club partner. I nodded, went to bed, and repeated to myself that trust was the foundation of everything. She started coming over more often, always with the excuse of helping me improve the workshop's accounting or bringing me hard-to-get parts. I appreciated the gesture. He would sit at the kitchen table, my wife would make him coffee, and I would see them exchange jokes, wisecracks, complicit glances. In my head, that was normal. C was the friend who cares. L was the generous hostess. I did not see the subtext. I did not want to see it. I will say, in my defense, that the heart tends to protect itself with veils. One afternoon, Jay asked to speak with me alone, something urgent. I knew him well enough to notice the seriousness with which he frowned. We went to his truck, and he showed me his phone. They were screenshots that an acquaintance had sent him. Messages between C and my wife with affectionate phrases that sounded too intimate to be just friends. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding, that the written tone can seem like something else. I tried to say it out loud, but my jaw locked, and the excuses dissolved. I thanked Jay for his loyalty. In an act that I now recognize as desperate, I decided to do nothing. I thought that, perhaps, she would explain it to me, that I would discover that it all made sense. That night, I had trouble sleeping. She came home late, said the library meeting had run long. I wanted to believe her. The final blow came on an anodyne Wednesday, turned into an indelible date. She asked me to come home early. She needed to talk about something important. I left the workshop closed earlier than usual, and, upon entering, I noticed a dense silence. In the living room, 2 suitcases occupied the space next to the sofa. She was standing, her hands clasped over her chest, her eyes bright with decision. She invited me to sit down, but my legs refused to cooperate. She began to speak in a tone I had never heard from her, cold and almost rehearsed. She said she was leaving, that for months she had felt alive with another person. I let out a murmur of disbelief. She did not stop. She added that the other person was C, my best friend, my chosen brother. She told me that it had all started innocently, sharing books and coffees, until they discovered a passion impossible to ignore. With him I feel electricity, adventure, endless projects, she said as she watched me, as if trying to convince me to accept a logical deal. With you, everything is stability, and stability is boring. I tried to speak, to ask for explanations, to remind her of our life, our plans, the shared laughter. I reached out my hand, wanting to touch her arm, but she backed away, looking towards the door. She said she did not want to see me beg, that she could not bear the idea of hurting me more with empty promises. She explained that C was waiting for her outside, that she would leave that very night. Without a tear, without a tremor in her voice, she said goodbye, picked up the suitcases, and disappeared before I could articulate a single coherent sentence. I was left in the middle of the living room with my fists clenched and my throat burning, listening to the sound of C's engine driving away. That hum became a dividing line, before and after. The first few days passed as if someone had turned off the switch of my consciousness and left me alone with an automatic body that breathed, walked, and went to bed without registering the passage of time. I would open my eyes at dawn, feel the cold space in the mattress, and be overcome by the feeling that this was not real, that she would return through the door saying it had all been a joke in very poor taste. I would have a cup of coffee for breakfast that would get cold before I could take the first sip. I forced myself to go to the workshop, but the engines seemed to speak a different language, and my hands would drop the wrenches for no reason. One morning, I saw my own reflection in the dust-covered window. Purple dark circles, a messy beard, a shirt stained with oil and dried sweat. I did not recognize myself. I threw the wrench against the metal floor, and the crash brought me back to reality. I closed early and walked aimlessly until the sun went down. I ended up sitting on the pier, watching the harbor lights blink, wondering at what exact point I had started to lose everything. The first intervention came from R. He entered my house one night, mustering the courage to knock me out with his kind energy. He brought bags of hot food that filled the kitchen with a smell of stew that reminded me of happy Sundays. He did not ask how I was, and did not mention Al. He simply put 2 plates on the table, served generous portions, and looked at me until I gave in and picked up the fork. The bite got stuck halfway because my throat closed up, but he was not impatient. He ate naturally, talking about anything, about a barge that had gotten stuck in the canal, about the new puppy his neighbors did not know how to train. When he saw that I was barely touching the food, he came up with a late-night plan, to climb onto the roof, spread out a blanket, and look at the stars like when we were teenagers. We followed it to the letter, shivering with cold, lying between tiles and dust. He let the silence empty me from the inside until I confessed, in a thin voice, that I felt a hole in my chest that was hard to fill. Remember, for more stories like this, subscribe, give it a like, and activate the bell. Let us continue. The next day, Jay showed up with his red truck full of firefighter gear. He honked the horn and shouted at me that the world does not stop just because 2 people drive off in a car. He forced me to get in and drove to the old forest trail where we used to run when we trained for the first neighborhood races. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Without giving me time to protest, he threw me some old sneakers and started running. I could not keep up with him, but every gulp of cold air reminded me that my muscles ached because they were alive. I stopped, panting, next to a fallen log. Jay came back, put a hand on my shoulder, and said he would not let the rage rust me from the inside. He told me about a fire he had put out that same week, about how the smoke suffocates you if you breathe deeply without protection. Pain is smoke, friend, he murmured. Close the door on it so it does not cloud your lungs. The third visit was from T. He came in with a briefcase full of folders and calculators. He sorted receipts, canceled joint cards, transferred the money left in the joint account to a new one in my name. He discovered that she had spent part of the savings on hotel reservations and creative advances for a trip with C, expenses she would never get to explain. Seeing the numbers, I understood that she had not only taken my trust, but also a portion of my future. T spoke calmly, as if explaining a balance sheet to an audience of beginners. This is a hole that will be plugged with time and discipline, he said. But first you have to get out of the cave. He handed me an envelope with cash to cover urgent bills and made me promise to attend a weekly support meeting that he himself would organize to review accounts and prevent me from falling into ruin through neglect. Thanks to them, the routine began to reassemble itself. I would get up early to run with Jay twice a week, have lunch with her at noon amidst forced laughter, and dedicate the afternoons to repairing engines with dedication, supervised by T, who would appear unexpectedly to ask me how much aluminum we had bought and how much we were selling each hour of work for. Little by little, I got clients back. The workshop smelled of new oil and plastic-wrapped parts again, a smell that reminded me of my childhood. Every invoice was a brick rebuilding the wall, torn down by betrayal. My parents played their part. My mother filled the refrigerator with lemon pie and stews I never had time to cook. My father would sit next to me in silence, letting his rough hands touch my back when he saw me standing still for too long. On one of those nights of mutual companionship, my old man told me that love is not a one-way street, that some people get out of the car halfway, and you cannot turn back to get them without getting lost yourself. The wheels keep turning, he murmured as he examined a cigarette he would never light because my mother forbade it. 2 months passed like this, where Elle's absent presence still floated in the corners of the house. I found strands of her hair in the shower drain, sticky notes with to-do lists on the refrigerator, bookmarks in the books she had left half-read. A part of me clung to the pain as a reminder that what we had had existed, that it was not a bad dream that would vanish upon waking. But another part, fueled by the dawn runs and tea's scrupulous order, pushed the nostalgia away. I started to sleep without nightmares and to look at the sky without feeling that everything was about to collapse. I convinced myself that I would never see her again, that life had decided to separate us with surgical brutality, and I had to accept the scar. The rainy afternoon she returned to my door was embedded in history like a rusty nail you step on barefoot. She was wearing a dirty coat, the lapels soaked, her mascara smudged on her cheeks. She seemed to have aged 10 years. She was holding a bag without a zipper, and her fingers were trembling with cold. She pronounced my name like a plea. I stood motionless by the trash can, my fingers clenched around the black bag, fearing that this ghost would tear down the foundations I had rebuilt. She began to speak in a rush. She said that everything had been a mistake, that C had been charming only to trap her, and then revealed his true character. Jealousy, shouting, scuffles, silent punishments in cheap motels, debts accumulated on cards he made her sign. She told me he had abandoned her in the middle of the road during a fight, that she had lost her phone trying to get help, that she had been wandering from station to station for days without enough money to eat. I listened without moving a muscle. Every word of hers was an echo of the interview that had stolen my peace. I felt compassion, a reflex I could not turn off, but that compassion hit a wall built painstakingly with sleepless nights. When she finished, she looked up with tear-filled eyes. She asked me to come in, to take a shower, to sleep, to talk like adults in the morning. I told her that this house was no longer her home. She knelt, grabbed my knees, sobbed that I was the true love of her life, that she needed to return to the stability she had despised. I heard myself tell her that the door closed when she slammed it on her way out. I turned around, went into the house, and with firm hands, I locked the deadbolt. Her crying mixed with the rain, and I let it fade away without turning the knob. The next day, Jay found a note on the door of the volunteer fire station. Elle was looking for shelter. He offered her a hot coffee at the station and gave her the address of a women's shelter downtown. He called to let me know and to check if I agreed. I replied that everyone must bear the consequences of their actions. I appreciated the humanitarian gesture, but I asked not to be involved. That night, I slept soundly. The week continued with insistent text messages from unknown numbers, begging me to talk to Elle, hesitant emails in which she confessed her regret and asked for a second chance. I did not answer any of them. T advised me to block her to avoid relapses. I obeyed. Then, she started looking for my parents, for R, for J, begging them to intercede. My friends were blunt. They made it clear that after her betrayal, there was no bridge to cross back over. R warned her to stop looking for them. J reminded her that my wounds had barely healed. Elle was left alone, clinging to a net she had burned on her own. In the workshop, my concentration improved remarkably. I bought new tools, painted the gate a metallic blue color that gave a modern feel. I hired 2 young apprentices and dedicated myself to teaching them the tricks my father had taught me. One afternoon, while dismantling a gearbox with one of the boys, I received a notification that Elle had filed for divorce. I was not surprised. Being in the red, she needed to liquidate assets and seek any financial compensation. I met with the lawyer T recommended and signed the necessary documentation to initiate the process myself as well, making sure everything was quick and cold. During the preliminary hearings, Elle arrived in borrowed clothes and with a public defender. She avoided my gaze. At some point, when the legal representatives left us alone, she tried to speak. She started with an "I am sorry" that broke in half. I asked her to focus on the practical terms: division of assets, the house, half the value of the workshop. She let out a tear when she realized she would get almost nothing, as the expenses she incurred with C were registered in her name. She tried to argue that I was earning more since the betrayal, that I had a prosperous business. My lawyer replied with the list of withdrawals she had made without my consent. The judge listened to both sides with a neutral expression and issued a relatively simple resolution. The house would remain in my name, as I was paying the mortgage. She was left with her personal belongings and the freedom to sell the gifts C had bought her. We left the courthouse without saying goodbye. The echo of her footsteps resonated on the stairs as she tried to hold back her tears. The news of our formal separation ran through the town like a spark in dry grass. Most people already knew the whole story: the gossip of the romantic escape, the public disappointment, and the pitiful return. Some shopkeepers refused to give her credit after learning about the debts she was carrying. Others, although they did not approve of my silence, understood that I had no responsibility for the situation she had gotten herself into. She went from being the smiling librarian to the sad-eyed woman who walked the streets in search of any job. The municipal library hired a new assistant and did not open any vacancies. Elle applied at cafes, clothing stores, even at a workshop next to mine. Everywhere she received polite excuses, that they already had a full staff, that they needed references she could not provide. The debts cornered her. Every time someone accepted her application, they asked her to sign papers that she could not complete due to a lack of a fixed address or a financial guarantor. One afternoon, while greasing a transmission, I saw through the workshop's blinds Elle crossing the street carrying 2 plastic bags and a broken suitcase. She did not come in. She continued towards the bus station. I knew from Jay, who was patrolling the area, that she was found that night crying behind a dumpster, trying to shelter from the cold. The ambulance took her to the hospital to treat a wound on her eyebrow. She was diagnosed with mild dehydration and referred to a shelter. T showed up the next day with a pamphlet about psychological support programs for abuse victims. I thought about taking it to her. Then I understood that I had to respect the line I had drawn myself. On the day of the final hearing, she arrived late, with a bandage on her forehead. She wanted to speak to me, but the judge called her to the stand before she could start the conversation. When it was all over and we signed the final documents, she looked at me with swollen eyes and let out a final whisper: "Forgive me." I nodded slightly. I said nothing. A shared taxi was waiting for her outside. The driver helped her put the bags in. I saw her drive away without looking back, just like that first night. Only this time her shadow seemed to be dragging a weight impossible to let go of. I returned to the workshop, breathed in the soft smoke of new oil, and felt something close to calm. My friends came over that night with pizzas, and we turned on the television to watch a game. R cheered for the first goal. Jay threw cheese crumbs in the air. T laughed like I had not seen him in a long time. It took me a few seconds to realize that I was smiling effortlessly. We toasted with cold beer, not for the bitter end, but for the simple fact of still being here, together, navigating a route that did not include hidden betrayals. C had disappeared from the city shortly after abandoning Elle. According to rumors, he went south with the intention of starting a business that failed in weeks. I never heard from him again. It was better that way. The following weeks were a rediscovery. I painted the living room with light colors. I replaced the wedding photographs with seascapes I had taken with my mobile phone on fishing mornings. I bought a new armchair, gave away the dishes she had chosen, and had a shelf made where I placed books I started to read out of curiosity: car history manuals, biographies of inventors, even a poetry book she had recommended to me before our story broke. I learned to cook more elaborate dishes than emergency scrambled eggs. I allowed myself the luxury of traveling once a month to parts fairs in nearby cities. I slept in cheap hostels, walked at dawn through unknown streets, and returned with rare parts and anecdotes from my apprentices. One morning, I received a certified letter. It was from Elle. I did not open it for hours. I carried it in the pocket of my overalls, aware of its presence without daring to read it. Finally, sitting on the bench behind the workshop and surrounded by the aroma of freshly polished metal, I broke the envelope. The letter was brief. She wished me the best. She said she apologized for all the damage caused, that she understood if I did not respond, but she needed to ask for my forgiveness definitively. She said she planned to move to live with her distant brother, in search of a fresh start. She signed with her full name and a postscript. Thank you for having loved me when I did not know how to love myself. I felt no anger, nor relief, just a serene stillness, as if the final chapter had been written without a fuss. I put the letter in a folder with other memories, not to read it every day, but to remember the lessons carved in fire. That night, at the usual meeting with my friends, I told them about the letter. We toasted once more, not to celebrate her failure, but to honor the reconstruction we had achieved. I discovered that life, when lived with honesty and true companionship, is capable of welding broken metals with an unsuspected strength. And I understood that engines, just like wounded hearts, roar again if the right parts are found and the bolts are tightened with patience and tenacity.